just like that. For reassembly, this goes under that spring that's up top here. And fits right into that little groove. And this does not set flush at the bottom. If you try to flush it up, you'll have problems. If you look right here, that hole needs to have clearance from the frame for that spring to come through. Right there. So it'll actually set up high enough that it'll clear the frame. Take that little J hook, hold it in place. From underneath, put that little J hook end into that hole from the bottom up, and then it's just a matter of getting that spring back into the frame. Just like that. As you can see, that's back in. It's pretty easy to do. Alright, just because it's easy, we will start with the takedown lever. And remember, the plunger here has to be pushed down far enough so that the plunger will sit inside of the cutout right here on the takedown lever. Now the takedown lever, that cutout needs to face towards the bottom. So that cutout is here, needs to face down towards the bottom of the firearm, so that as the plunger pushes up, it pushes up against that cutout. So push this down, push that in there. That's all there is to that. Okay, next part is the trigger. This is one of the trickiest parts of the whole reassembly. Trigger and the trigger spring. The trigger spring goes in the trigger with the long side of the spring facing towards the front of the firearm, short side of the spring facing the back of the firearm. The short side of the spring will actually fit onto this little platform in the back of this trigger on the inside. The long side of the spring, a little bend, will fit into the cutout on the inside of the frame right here. There's a little hole there. Now remembering how that spring goes in there, okay, with the coil facing up, so it'll be inside the trigger like that. The coil faces up. That's what allows that coil spring to have pressure. That's what makes this part so tricky. What I found to be the easiest way to do that is find a pin punch that fits this, and a second pin punch that fits this. That's your first goal. Put the trigger inside the frame, into the position it goes in the frame. Use the larger pin punch in the larger hole to hold it in place, and by doing that, that pin punch will actually create tension against the spring to make sure that the spring goes in properly. Now, move that trigger, tip the trigger forward as far as you can get it, so you can get the spring in there. Slide that spring in there. Look inside the frame at the spring. Make sure that the front of that spring goes into the hole. But once you get the front of that spring in there, keeping it in there also is the mother. If you look down inside this hole, you'll be able to see part of the spring. The object is to get the other pin punch through that hole, through the loop or the coil in the spring, and then out the other side, which is where the trigger retaining pin goes. What I like to do is use a screw, or a screwdriver, a small one, on the back side to push on that spring to get it to line up with the hole, and then push that punch through. Now you have both punches in the holes. Trigger is functioning properly. Once you have it like that, this punch you can go ahead and just get out of your way. Holding this one in place to make sure it doesn't come out. Use it as a guide to guide your trigger retaining pin back through the same hole. That will act as a guide to keep the spring and everything from popping back off while you put this all back together. Just keep finagling it. It'll go. There it goes. Now it's at least past the spring. Once it's past the spring, you can flip it over and visually look to make sure the pin is lined up. And I've got the pin lined up. It's through the spring, through the trigger, and started in that hole on the inside of the frame. So roll it over, and again, I recommend using a plastic tipped hammer for this, which I don't have, so just be careful. A couple of light taps. Make sure it's in there flush. Trigger's reinstalled. Now, once that's in there, next thing I'm going to do is the magazine release. You have the three parts. You've got the magazine release plunger or screw, and you have the magazine release and the magazine release spring. Put these parts together so that the spring goes inside the magazine release, and that plunger, the little part that sticks up on that plunger, fits down into the cutout on the magazine release. Use the screwdriver, put it in place, push that all the way in, and then turn the screwdriver to lock it in the compressed position. If you're holding the frame as you're going to shoot it, facing away from you, on the right side, there's a cutout, a key-shaped cutout. The magazine release, that little flange on the magazine release, matches up with that cutout. Put it in there. Make sure it drops all the way in, it's fully seated. Once it's fully seated, this is really easy. Just turn that screwdriver counterclockwise until it's lined back up with the cutout on the side of the magazine release, and the spring will pop it back out and it's locked in place. Now your magazine release is in there. Alright, what's next is the slide lock. Now, if you notice on the slide lock spring, one of the two tails is longer than the other. On the slide lock, there's a cutout on the slide lock lever. The longer tail goes in that cutout. On the frame, there's another cutout. The shorter end of that tail goes in that cutout. Place the spring on the post of the slide lock. Push it down. And I put it on backwards. Push it down and make sure that the longer of the two sides of that spring, the longer tail, is in the slide lock. Once you have that started, take the frame from the left side, or the same side as the magazine release button. Start that into the frame, into that hole right above the magazine release button. It'll be right there. If you look, once you get that seated, if you look at the side of the frame, you'll see that spring right there. The long side is seated in the slide lock. Short side is kind of sticking out there. Just seat that so that it's seated as far as it'll go with the spring not in place. Just use a screwdriver and push that spring up until it either catches on the side of the frame or goes inside the frame, and then just push it until it fits down into that cutout. Flip it up and make sure that both sides of the spring are properly seated in both of their cutouts. And your slide lock is now reassembled.